Welcome to this video. In this video we're going to discuss chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, also called COPD. So let me firstly outline the structure for this video. I'm going to start off by giving a basic definition of COPD. Then what we're going to do is we're going to revise the structure of the lungs, in particular the structure of the tracheobronchial tree and the structure of the different airways as you go down the tracheobronchial tree. Then what we'll do is we'll discuss the two major components of COPD, namely emphysema and chronic bronchitis, and we'll go through the pathogenesis of emphysema and chronic bronchitis. After that, we'll talk about acute exacerbations of COPD, which are one of the major things that leads to people going into hospital. It's one of the major things that people come into hospital with. And finally, we'll discuss the treatment for COPD. Right, so let me begin then by giving a very basic definition of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And this is just the basic definition that I got by going on Google and typing in define COPD. So it's going to be a very basic definition, but it's going to be the thing that we will start off with and then we'll build up from there. Okay, so the very basic definition of COPD is that it is a lung disease. So that's point number one. So I'll just choose a colour and we'll start off with white here. So COPD is a lung disease, and it's a lung disease that is characterised by chronic airflow obstruction. So obstruction to the flow of air within the tracheobronchial tree of the lungs. So it's a lung disease, and specifically it's a lung disease that is characterised by chronic obstruction to airflow. So chronic airflow obstruction. And another part to this that's important is that this chronic airflow obstruction is not completely reversible. Okay, so you can't reverse this chronic airflow obstruction completely, for instance, with bronchodilators, as indeed you can in asthma. So asthma is a disease where you get airflow obstruction as well in asthmatic attacks, but you can reverse it with the bronchodilator drugs, whereas in COPD, this airflow obstruction cannot be fully reversed. So that's another thing that I'll add on here, that it's not fully reversible. Okay, so as I say, that's the starting definition that we're going to use for COPD, but we'll get a much better idea of what this disease is all about as we progress through the video. Okay, the next thing that I want to do, just before we move on to our revision of the structure of the lungs, is say, what is the cause of COPD? Now, the cause of COPD is chronic inhalation of noxious gases, and especially in the developed world, the major source of chronic inhalation of noxious gases is smoking. So indeed, COPD is the disease of smokers usually. So I'll write that down. So COPD, the cause of it is long term, and I'll put chronic therefore. So chronic inhalation of some sort of noxious gas. So it is the disease that occurs when you are inhaling horrible things into your lungs for a very long period of time. So chronic inhalation, and I've missed out a word there, of noxious gases. And in particular, the big one that often causes COPD is cigarette smoke. And it's almost guaranteed that if you smoke cigarettes for a very, very long period of time, so for instance, if you start smoking at, let's say, 18 and you continue throughout your life, then it's almost guaranteed that in your old age you will develop COPD, if not before. So it is a disease that you will get if you smoke for a very, very long period of time. The good news is that you can stop the progression of COPD by stopping smoking, and to some extent your lungs can then heal once you've stopped smoking and the damage that you've already done can get better. So stopping smoking is fundamentally the best treatment for COPD. It's the only treatment that we currently have that can stop the progression of the disease. No drug that we can give you can stop the progression of the disease. The only thing you can do is stop exposure to this noxious gas, and usually that's cigarette smoke, so you need to stop smoking. Okay, so obviously everyone knows and is very afraid of the fact that smoking can cause lung cancer, but not everyone who smokes will get lung cancer, whereas if you smoke for a very long period of time in your life and you don't quit, then you are almost guaranteed to get COPD. And it is a very scary disease as well, what it does to you. Okay, right. However, there are other noxious gases that you can inhale for long periods of time that will cause COPD as well. It's not exclusively cigarette smoke. So if you're inhaling smoke from coal or wood fires as well, that will also lead to COPD if it's done over a long period of time. And the key here is that you understand that this needs to be a chronic inhalation. So you need to be inhaling this on a regular basis for an extremely long period of time, over decades, for the damage to build up to the point that it's actually going to be symptomatic. Okay, so coal or wood smoke will also cause COPD if it's inhaled for a long period of time. Okay, right, so there's some basic facts about COPD then. Let's now begin our revision of the structure of the lungs and the tracheobronchial tract, and then we'll be able to develop our understanding of COPD further by looking at the pathogenesis. So, let me move this upwards, and now we'll move on to the structure of the lungs. So, we'll go to blue for this. So, structure of the lungs. So this is hopefully a revision, but it's extremely important that we go over this so that we've got an understanding of the structure of the bronchi, the structure of the bronchioles, the structure of the alveoli, for when we want to actually discuss the pathogenesis of COPD. Right, so let's begin by drawing a very basic picture of the lungs, then we'll discuss what the lungs are actually made up of, and then we'll discuss the tracheobronchial tree. So, I'm going to start, as I say, by drawing a very basic picture that I hope you've seen before. So I'm just going to draw the lungs along with the trachea, the carina, and the two major bronchi going into the lungs as viewed from the front. So, this is going to represent then the right lung. And then on this side, we'll have the left lung. And remember, the two lungs are not symmetric, because the left lung has this notch in it here where the heart will be. So this is known as the cardiac notch of the left lung here. Okay, so those are the two lungs. And now here is the trachea, or the windpipe. And it will split up into the two main bronchi. And of course you have the right main bronchus and the left main bronchus here, and the point where the trachea bifurcates into the two major bronchi here is known as the carina. So I'll put some of these key terms here. So we've got the trachea, which is here. The point where it bifurcates is the carina. So that's here. And then it's splitting into the two major bronchi. Okay, excellent. So there's my basic picture of the lungs. So the next question that we need to ask ourselves is, what are the lungs actually made up of? And these things are incredibly light. If you've ever done anatomy and you've done dissection and you've held the lungs, they are incredibly light. They're almost like sponges when you pick them up. They're very light, and that's because they're filled with air mainly. And the major body of the lungs is made up of loads of little air sacs known as alveoli. So these structures, these lungs, are made up of loads and loads of little air sacs called alveoli. So these are walled sacs of air. So in the middle will be air. So I'll just draw a little picture of an alveolus. So it's like this. Here is the wall of the alveolus, which will be made up of an epithelium of cells, and then you've got the air sac in the middle. And the lungs are just made up of loads and loads of these alveoli. So alveoli is the plural, alveolus will be the singular. And now, all of the alveoli, they have to be connected up to the trachea, because remember, the way that fresh air is brought in from the environment into the alveoli is via the trachea. So fresh air comes in through the trachea, goes through the bronchi, and it needs to somehow get into the alveoli, because these are the sites of where gas exchange is actually going to occur, where oxygen can go from the alveolar space into the bloodstream, and carbon dioxide can go from the bloodstream into the alveolar space. So they need to be connected up to this supply of fresh air. So there is something called the tracheobronchial tract, or the respiratory tract inside each lung, which is basically a huge connection network whereby every in alveolus is connected back up through a huge number of tubes that get progressively bigger as you go from the alveolus up towards the trachea, in order that every single alveolus, and these things are tiny, microscopic structures, in order that every single one of them is connected up to the trachea. And that's what we're now going to study, the tracheobronchial tract and the different levels of the tracheobronchial tract. So I think we'll change colour, we'll go to red. So we want to study the tracheo, which means pertaining to the trachea, and then bronchial, which means pertaining to the bronchi, so it's a tract that contains both the trachea and the bronchi, is all that means. So we wanted to study this tracheobronchial tract, and as I said, there's another name for the tracheobronchial tract. You can also call it the respiratory tract. And this is basically the connection network inside the lungs that means that all the alveoli are going to be connected up back to the trachea, so that fresh air can come from the trachea to the alveoli, and that stale air from the alveoli can go back up towards the trachea. Right. So let's now begin our discussion of the tracheobronchial tract then. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the trachea out of this picture, and then pull the bronchi out, and then show you what will happen after the major bronchus. So we'll do this here. So here, once again, this is the trachea, and here are the two main bronchi. So we have the right main bronchus and the left main bronchus. So what's going to happen is these are going to enter the lungs, and then they'll start dividing again. Okay, so the trachea bifurcated into two now, the major bronchi will divide into two smaller airways now. So we'll do this on the right side. So here, this one has divided into two. So here's the right main bronchus, and it's now divided into two. And then the division process continues. So this one might divide into, I don't know, maybe three this time. And I think it does divide into three, this one that goes up to the top of the right lung. So here are three coming off this one here. So here is this airway, and it's now splitting into this one, and that one going off behind. And then this one at the top might split into two more further, and the division process continues and continues, and you gradually go to smaller and smaller airways, and this is all happening inside the lungs. Okay, and this is what we call the tracheobronchial tract. So how do we make sense of this? Well, one of the ways that we can do it is we can give all of the airways what's known as a generation number. So let me just explain what is meant by a generation number. So I'll use this little symbol for number rather. Okay, so the way this works is this tells you how many divisions you've had to go through in order to get to that level of airway. So the trachea is given the number 0. So you start off with the trachea, and that has generation number 0. Then for the two main bronchi here, the right bronchus and the left bronchus, they're given the generation number 1. And this all makes sense because in order to get to one of these airways, so if we're, for instance, talking about the right main bronchus here, in order to get to that one, we've had to split, we've had to go through one division since the trachea, okay, hence why it's given 1. These airways, these two here, they would now be given the generation number 2, and that's because if you're a little man standing in this one, in order to get back to the trachea, you have to go through how many how many splits? 1 and then 2. Or alternatively, if you wanted to go from the trachea to this, how many splits would you have to go through? You'd have to go through 1 here, and you chose to go down this one, and then you get to another junction, and you then choose to go down here, and that's 2 junctions overall, so it's given generation number 2, and hopefully you're getting the idea now. So let's continue on with our picture. This one here would have generation number 3, and these 2 here would have generation number 4. So you can follow the tracheobronchial tree down, and you can ascribe to every airway that you go through a generation number, and that's one of the ways that we can make sense of the tracheobronchial tract. Now, as you progressively go through the tracheobronchial tract, the structure of the walls of the airways gradually changes, and you gradually go through airways that are called different things because they have different structures. So we talk, for instance, about there being bronchi, and then bronchioles, and then there are respiratory bronchioles and alveolar ducts. And I want to talk about what the different wall structure of those different types of airways is, and what sort of generation numbers those different airways are going to go between. So let me start by talking then about bronchi. So what is a bronchus? So bronchi is the plural, bronchus is the singular. What's the definition of an airway that we would call a bronchus? Well, the definition is that these are airways that still have cartilage surrounding them, whereas the bronchioles after them don't have cartilage surrounding them. And typically, the airways that are between generation number 1 and generation number 10 are what we would call bronchi. Okay, so if you're in an airway and it's between, it's one of these, it has a generation number between 1 and 10, then it's unlikely that that will be a bronchus. However, that's not the definition of a bronchus. The definition of a bronchus is based on the wall structure. I'm saying that it's unlikely that if you're in an airway of generation number between 1 and 10, it will have this structure and it will be called a bronchus. So all the things that we've drawn on this picture will most definitely be bronchi. Okay, so let me now go through what the wall structure then of a bronchus is. So I'll move this down like so, and we'll now draw the histological structure. So I think we'll begin on the inside and then we'll work outwards. So beginning with the innermost layer then, the innermost layer of the bronchial wall is made up of ciliated columnar epithelial cells. So we'll start by drawing this layer of cells, and we'll do it in this faint pink colour here. So I'll start by drawing a circle here, which can be the basal surface of these cells, and then another circle inside, which can be the apical surface of these cells. And this hole in the middle will be the lumen of the airway then. So now to divide this layer up into the separate cells, so here's one cell, here's another cell, and those dots that I'm putting in are clearly the nuclei. Here's another cell, more cells. I'll just finish this up now. And what we'll need to add on to this picture after I've finished dividing up the layer into the separate cells is the cilia of these cells, which are going to participate in the mucociliary escalator. So here, these little finger-like projections are going to be the cilia of the apical surface of these cells, like so. Right, so I'll just write down the name of these cells. These are the ciliated columnar epithelial cells. So ciliated describes the fact that they are ciliated, they have cilia on their surfaces. Columnar describes their shape, they're quite long and thin like a column, and they are epithelial cells because they are lining the respiratory epithelium. So ciliated columnar epithelial cells. Now, on the apical surface of these ciliated columnar epithelial cells, we've discussed that there are these cilia, and on the surface of the cilia is going to be a mucus layer, and I now just want to draw this mucus layer in. So we'll do this in green. So on the apical surface of the cilia here, in green, I'm representing the mucus, and the mucus and the cilia together are going to make the mucociliary escalator. And the idea with this is that when you breathe in pathogens or particles of dirt into the airways, they will get stuck in this mucus, and the cilia then gradually beat and move the mucus upwards and outwards. So they move the mucus towards the trachea, so they will move in the direction towards the trachea. So giving an example here, let's say we were in this airway up here, then the cilia will be moving in this direction to move the mucus in this direction so that it's going towards where the trachea is. And then of course once it gets to the trachea's cilia will be moving upwards, and therefore the mucus will be moved upwards and through the larynx to the laryngopharynx, and then it can be swallowed down the esophagus and go to the stomach where it will be destroyed. Okay, so in green there we have the mucus, and together the mucus and the ciliary, the cilia of the ciliated columnar epithelial cells, they produce the mucociliary escalator, which is an extremely efficient way of making sure that the lungs, the airways, are kept clear of pathogens and dirt particles. It's very, very efficient at doing so. Now, we'll discuss where the mucus is going to be produced from later on. So we'll come back to that when we get to the submucosal glands of the bronchi. Right, so now let's go backwards. So what are the ciliated columnar epithelial cells sitting on? Well, they will be sitting on a basement membrane. All epithelia always have a basement membrane. The epithelial cells will always be on a basement membrane, and this basement membrane will consist of lots of connective tissue that will be very rigid, and this is the stuff that the epithelial cells are actually attached to. So what stops the epithelial cells from falling into the lumen? It's because they are attached to a basement membrane, and I'll draw this basement membrane in now in red. Right, so here it comes. So in red here, this is the basement membrane, and you can see that I'm making sure that it's at the base of the ciliated columnar epithelial cells, and that's because they're all attached to it, and this is the rigid structure that they're attached to, which stops them falling into the lumen of the bronchus. Right, so in red here, this is the basement membrane made up of lots of connective tissue, rigid connective tissue. Right, so what's then underneath the basement membrane? Underneath the basement membrane there is a thick layer of connective tissue known as the lamina propria, and I'll draw this layer now in this yellow colour. Okay, so we'll have it going on top of there, and this is going to contain blood vessels, so capillaries, which will be giving nutrients to the epithelial cells. And it's also going to contain immune cells, as we'll see later, and they're going to be important in the pathogenesis of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So for now, though, we'll just represent this as a connective tissue layer, because that's mainly what it consists of. Amongst the connective tissue, you'll have blood vessels and also immune cells, but majorly it just consists of connective tissue. So in yellow here, this is the lamina, which just means layer, and then propria. So it's the proper connective tissue layer underneath the basement membrane. Right, so what then is outside of the lamina propria? Outside of the lamina propria you have a smooth muscle cell layer. So let's draw this layer on now in red. So here we go. And it will consist of bronchial smooth muscle cells, which are the classical sort of smooth muscle cell shape, i.e. a spindle shape where they'll have a wide centre and then narrow ends. So here we go, there's the bronchial smooth muscle cell layer, and just to complete this layer up, let's draw a picture of a single bronchial smooth muscle cell. So here, this can represent a single bronchial smooth muscle cell, and as you can see I've drawn it in this spindle shape where it's got a wide centre here and then narrow ends on either side, like so. And you'll have lots of these bronchial smooth muscle cells connected in rings. So you'll have one like so, and then you might have another one connected up here, and then another one connected to that, and another one connected to that, and they'll go round and form a whole ring of bronchial smooth muscle cells. And this means that when all of those bronchial smooth muscle cells in a ring contract, their lengths will shorten, and therefore the circumference of the entire ring of bronchial smooth muscle cells will also decrease. And when the circumference of a ring decreases, the diameter of that ring also decreases, and that means that it's going to constrict the bronchus, in particular constrict the lumen, and therefore the contractile state of these bronchial smooth muscle cells controls the diameter of the bronchus lumen. Okay, so let's write on the name then of this layer. So this is the bronchial smooth muscle cell layer, and I could abbreviate smooth muscle cell down to SMC if I wanted to save some time. So bronchial smooth muscle cell, or SMC layer. Right, okay, so that's the next layer of the bronchus wall. Outside of the lamina propria, you then have the smooth muscle cell layer called the bronchial smooth muscle cell layer, consisting of bronchial smooth muscle cells. Right, so now going out even further, outside the bronchial smooth muscle cell layer, what do we have? We now have another layer of connective tissue known as the submucosal layer, and this contains glands known as the submucosal glands, which are responsible for the production of the mucus in the bronchi. They're the major things responsible for the production of the mucus in the bronchi. So let me now draw this layer in, and I'll do it in this light, sort of yellowy green colour here. So outside of our bronchial smooth muscle cell layer, we now have this layer here, and this is representing the submucosa. And as they say, this consists of lots of connective tissue, like the lamina propria, but also amongst the connective tissue you're going to have little tubes which correspond to the submucosal glands. So I'll now just draw one of these in here. So this tube here, this might correspond to a submucosal gland, and it's going to consist of an epithelium, like so, which will also be a columnar epithelium. And in fact, I might just zoom in on this gland that I'm drawing here, like so. Okay, so now I can do it in more detail. So here are the epithelial cells that I'm giving nuclei now. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cells lining this tube here. Here's the lumen of the tube, and there would be a basement membrane around the basal side of these cells as well. And this is what we call a submucosal gland. And the purpose of this submucosal gland is to produce the mucus, and in order to do this you need two types of cell. So the major type of cell is going to secrete a serous secretion, and then there's going to be another type of cell known as a goblet cell, which is going to secrete the mucin components, which will turn the serous secretion into a mucus secretion. Okay, so let me write some of this down here now. So that gland that we've got there is an example of a submucosal gland, and it consists of two types of cell lining it. It's a tube that will be lined by two major types of cell. One cell will be secreting the serous secretion, and the serous secretion consists of water with salt dissolved in it, so sodium chloride dissolved in it, so that it's reasonably isotonic with the extracellular fluid. Okay, so that's what is meant by a serous secretion. It's basically just water with some electrolytes dissolved in it. And then there's another type of cell known as a goblet cell, which will be secreting a glycoprotein known as mucin. And I'll just create, let's say, a goblet cell on my little picture. So zooming, let me undo that. Zooming back in on our picture of the submucosal gland, let's turn one of these cells into a goblet cell. So let's say that this cell is going to be a goblet cell. So the one that I've coloured in green there might be a goblet cell. So scattered amongst the normal columnar epithelial cells, you're going to have these goblet cells. I've drawn one in here in green, and these will be secreting this glycoprotein known as mucin into the lumen of the submucosal gland, and the mucin turns the serous secretion secreted by the other cells here into a mucus secretion, so it makes it much more viscous, it makes it much more sticky, it turns it into a mucus secretion. Okay, so let's zoom back out now. So mucin is the thing that they're producing, and this is a glycoprotein, so it's a protein with carbohydrate modifications made to it that will be secreted into the serous secretion and will make the serous secretion much more viscous, much more sticky. It will turn it into a mucus secretion. So the serous secretion with the mucin, this makes you a mucus secretion. So what I can now do then is, if I zoom in here, I can fill that lumen then with mucus, like so. So it will be filled with mucus. And these tubes that are running in the submucosal layer, they will eventually penetrate through the smooth muscle cell layer, they'll penetrate through the lamina propria, and then they'll open up onto the surface of the respiratory epithelium here. So these tubes are actually continuous with the respiratory epithelium. They will penetrate through the other layers, and then they'll open up onto the respiratory epithelium, and therefore the mucus that's produced in these submucosal glands will therefore be deposited onto the surface of the epithelium of the bronchus, and there's where the mucus for the mucociliary escalator is actually going to come from. Okay, so that's what the submucosal glands are then for. So let me go back to my very light colour, which here it is. I'll make the pen thinner again. So this mainly consists of connective tissue, but you'll have submucosal glands amongst the connective tissue, and I've drawn in one. In reality, you'd have far more of those. I'm just too lazy to draw them in. So that's what the submucosal layer consists of. It's a connective tissue layer with these submucosal glands which are going to be producing the mucus that's going to be secreted onto the surface of the respiratory epithelium, and which is important in the mucociliary escalator. Okay, so let's now go to the layer outside the submucosal layer, the final layer of the bronchial wall, which is the cartilage layer. So I will pick another colour for this, and we'll go, I think, to blue. So the final layer outside of the submucosal layer is another connective tissue layer, but this connective tissue layer is going to contain great big lumps of cartilage in it. So, or great big plates of cartilage is probably a better term to use. So this structure that I'm drawing here in blue, this is representing a cartilaginous plate. Here is another cartilaginous plate here, and then we'll have another one over here. Okay? So you'll have gaps in between cartilaginous plates. It's not a continuous layer of cartilage that surrounds the bronchus. Instead, it's these cartilaginous plates, and you've got these gaps in between the cartilaginous plates, and these will be filled with connective tissue that isn't quite cartilage. So I might just put here, there'll be connective tissue in the gaps, but it's not cartilage. So in this light green colour here, we have our connective tissue shown, like so. So now let me just label up the fact that these structures in blue, these are cartilage plates. Right, so around the outside of the bronchus then we have these cartilaginous plates which protect the bronchus and make it very strong. And the trachea, which is in a way very similar to a massive bronchus, in fact it is effectively a massive bronchus, it has one great big cartilaginous plate that's in the shape of a horseshoe going all the way around it. So if I was drawing the trachea, the way I'd modify this picture to make it the trachea is it would have to obviously be very big, but I would make the cartilaginous plate one great big horseshoe, like so. So all of this would now become cartilage here. This will become cartilage here as well. And now I've got one great big horseshoe-shaped cartilaginous plate going all the way around here, and then only right at the back of the trachea, the bit facing the esophagus at the back, then does not have cartilage around it. So if we're talking about the trachea, you have a great big horseshoe of cartilage, whereas once we're in the bronchi, those just have cartilaginous plates separated by non-cartilaginous connective tissue. Okay, and the function of this cartilage is to provide rigid structure to the wall of the bronchus or the wall of the trachea. Right, so I think we'll have a break there. We have now discussed the structure of the bronchial wall. We'll continue on with our discussion of the tracheobronchial tree in the next video. We'll then talk about, in which we'll talk about bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, and the alveoli.